Wonderful. Okay, welcome everyone to our third part of our three-part series of our plant diagnostics training course for this fall 2024. Welcome to everyone, whether you've been with us from the beginning, the middle, or are just now joining us at the very end. Thank you to those who are tuning in also and watching the recordings at later times. I know it's difficult to find a time that works for everyone to do these live synchronous webinar style type presentations, but thank you for your interest in learning more about plant diagnostics. So today's topic is going to be about integrated pest management, and I'm going to tie in some tips and tricks and information on how this relates to working with the public, as many of us are University of Maryland Extension Master Gardener volunteers. And I would argue all of us in some way are science communicators, whether it is speaking to friends and family members about their garden or about pollinators or about managing pests with our indoor or outdoor plants. So in some capacity, we are communicating science type information to different people. So whether you're actually a trained Master Gardener volunteer or speaking with friends and family, you are a science communicator. I will introduce myself once again. My name is Madeline Potter. I'm a faculty specialist for entomology and integrated pest management with the University of Maryland Extension, specifically our Home and Garden Information Center. So part of my role is to train and educate the public, as well as University of Maryland Extension faculty, staff, and volunteers on topics such as beneficial insect conservation and sustainable insect pest management. So I've developed this fall this pilot training series, a lunch and learn style, as we're meeting for about an hour at noon to review these three key topics related to plant diagnostics in relation to pests that are known as insects and even mites and other arthropods. So thank you for joining us. Let's go ahead and get started here. So here is the schedule for this three-part series. So all of these have been recorded. If you haven't watched the recording for the previous two sessions, I highly recommend doing that after today's live session, or if you're watching today's the recording. So today we're on November 13th on our final topic. If you're wondering where to find these recordings, if you are registered for this training, why you are joining us now live through the Zoom, you will be emailed the recording links, but you can also find them here on the University of Maryland Extension Master Gardener website. It's specifically under these certain tabs, a little bit of a maze to get to, but reference this slide. And if you ever have any questions about finding where these recording links are, you can feel free to reach out to me or the Master Gardener State Office. And these links will not expire. They will always be accessible to you at any time. And you can feel free to share them out with people who may find them helpful. As we get started, I'll put up our program assurance statement, as well as our And Justice for All poster. And as a program, as University of Maryland Extension that partners with local, state, and federal government, we are required to collect demographic information on our program participants. So I'm about to launch a poll now called a self-identification survey. This is completely anonymous and optional. So I'm going to launch this poll. It is up to you if you would like to complete and fill out this anonymous survey called our self-identification survey. You may notice that for some of the questions, you do have the option to answer, I prefer not to say. So up to you if you would like to fill out this survey. I'll go ahead and launch that now. So it'll take about a couple minutes for those of you to fill out the survey who wish to. This is really important for us to help measure the effectiveness of our inclusive outreach efforts with our programming. So thank you for considering to fill out this self-identification survey. Wonderful. If you are still filling out that self-identification survey, feel free to do so. For sake of time, we're going to go ahead and move forward with today's session. A review of today's topics. We're going to start with what is integrative pest management, abbreviated as IPM. Then we'll get into IPM principles and practices, steps of an IPM plan, and then we'll conclude with some resources related to IPM, plant diagnostics, and entomology. Let's begin with what is integrated pest management. So I want for you to take a moment with whatever background experience or knowledge that you have related to this term of IPM, integrated pest management, and think of what this term means to you. What would be your definition? Doesn't have to be full written out definition. You can feel free, if you have your note-taking guide, to write your own definition or bullet points just to brainstorm and think what IPM currently means to you, if we've ever heard of this term before, or maybe it is a brand new term. Now, there are many definitions of IPM out there, many of which clearly represent IPM. It is a pretty broad field, as we can call it. And so I'm going to present a couple different definitions. We'll conclude with a very short and concise one that we'll use and reference throughout today's presentation. But feel free to also reference these longer ones I'll show, and there's lots of other ones out there as well. So its first definition is a knowledge-based decision-making process in which the selection, integration, and implementation of pest control tactics and management strategies are based on predicted economic, ecological, and sociological consequences. So we'll see here we have integration of different topics and themes, other things we would think about other than maybe the ecology of our landscape. Second definition we have here, a sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools. We'll get into what each of these categories mean later, in a way that minimizes economic, health, and environmental risks. Then here's our nice and short one that we'll use today, sustainable science-based decision-making process. So we can see we can make really long definitions because there's a lot that encompasses this term of integrated pest management. But when we really boil it down to something really simple, we can think of it as a sustainable science-based decision-making process, which we should be really familiar with as a Master Gardener volunteer. We've gone through that training. We are trained to present science-based information to the public. There are a lot of really great graphics and visuals of what IPM is, especially when we're talking about different IPM programs and plans. There's one here that was created by the Entomological Society of America, but there are many others out there that can be really helpful, especially if we are an educator in some way and we're teaching people for the first time about this concept of IPM. Now, when we're talking about integrative pest management, it's important to define the term of what is a pest. Now, we all come today with our own feelings toward what is a pest. We have our own experiences with maybe a certain insect that stung us or has been feeding on our plants. But what is a pest in terms of this field of IPM? Now, one definition is a species that interferes with human activities, property, health, or is objectionable. So depending on who you are, you may find most insects objectionable, or maybe just the ones that we're finding in our house that are biting us, and so on. But when we're talking about IPM, Integrated Pest Management, we define the term of a pest as a species that causes significant economic or aesthetic damage. This is really important here. They cause significant damage, not just a little bit of damage or possibly causing damage. We are actually seeing, or we know that they're going to cause significant damage to our plants in some way. And this is a part of sustainable pest management, which is going to be one of our principles and practices of IPM, and which is the goal to reduce pest populations, not to eliminate them. I've gone through lots of different webinars and trainings with the public, and I always get in the comments somewhere, how can I eliminate or eradicate this pest I'm seeing in my yard? Well, if we're thinking in a more sustainable term and way, even long-term pest control within our landscape, we're looking to lower pest populations, not to completely get rid of them. Now, in terms of what defines something as significant damage, this is going to vary depending on the situation. With our larger scale growers, with greenhouses, orchards, and in agriculture, they have set thresholds. They have a specific percentage or number amount that they reference while using monitoring to define if there is significant damage out in that field. And if then they have a pest that needs to be managed through IPM. Now, as home gardeners, this is going to not necessarily have a number to it or a percentage. It can be how we perceive that particular damage, how much damage we are seeing within our landscape. And there are also general guides from our research on terms of how much damage we'll tolerate before it really starts to impact plant health. And so here are some general categories of what are considered pests or could become pests within different IPM plans and programs. We have things like animals, which includes our insects and arthropods. We have disease-causing organisms, which includes fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. And we have our weeds as well. So a pest is very context dependent. No species is ever a pest in all places. And so even if we really don't like a certain type of insect, we always see it feeding on our plant. It's important to note that that particular species is not always considered a pest in every type of environment. If we think about our managed landscape versus wild habitat, a wooded edge, inside of a wooded area, that pest has a role within our ecosystems, both in our wild areas and even within our managed landscapes. Even if they're feeding on plants, that particular insect is food for other animals. It's a part of our ecological webs and food chains. So even if we don't like what it's doing, it has a role within our ecosystems. So it's not always a pest. Some species are pests in certain areas and times and not in others, as I was saying. And in most IPM programs, an organism is not considered a pest unless the damage is significant, as we are learning. Now, here's an example that I wanted to give when it comes to yellow jackets. Now, a lot of people, when we think of a yellow jacket or any sort of wasp, we assume it's going to sting us, it's bad, we need to get rid of it. Now, in some cases, we do want to remove where it is if it's in a high traffic area and we do have a high potential of these wasps stinging people. Maybe it's attached to our grill, as we can see with our top left picture. Maybe they're ground nesting in a certain area where we are walking quite a bit or our neighbors are walking. Maybe they're coming after and swarming around fallen fruit, which is pretty common this time of year. Or if we're having a picnic, we have our apple fritter while we're pumpkin picking with our apple cider and they're swarming around us. That can be really annoying and be a nuisance. Now, in other situations with our photos on our right, they play a beneficial role within our ecosystem. So sometimes it's prey for other predators like our robber flies we can see over here labeled as prey. So we have this predatory fly that feeds on yellow jackets sometimes. On our far right, we can see that yellow jackets and many of our other wasps play a role in pollination. And then on our bottom, we can see that yellow jackets are predators themselves feeding on other insects, potentially other insect pests. So it really depends on the situation. When we think about pest insects in the context of all the different insect species that are out there, approximately only 1 to 3% of all insect species are considered pests. Now, that may be surprising to a lot of people, especially if we have bad experiences with insects. We remember the pest insects more than maybe our beneficial ones, or we may not even know about these other beneficial insect species or the different roles that certain species can play, like we just learned with our yellow jackets. So, something really important to note. Now, as we get into learning about integrative pest management, if you're curious about the history of pest management, what led us to this term of integrated pest management and thinking more sustainably, I highly recommend this webpage by Penn State Extension. They call it A Brief History of Pest Management and IPM, and it goes through a lot of these three main eras, as you can see on our left, our pre-pesticide era, our pesticide era, and then our environmental movement and beginning of IPM. So really interesting, has a nice list of further information if you would like to learn more. Now we've learned briefly what is IPM. Now let's get into learning more about the principles and practices. So referencing back to our short definition, sustainable science-based decision-making process. So I've selected some key principles and practices that I think are really important as a beginner to IPM or even someone who has been using IPM for a long time, some things to refresh ourselves on. Now, there are definitely more principles and practices out there, but these are the ones that I think are really important to know about. So the first one to learn about is integrated goals. And some of these integrated goals and priorities can include things like human health and safety, environmental safety and sustainability, efficacy, how well a particular IPM program works to lower those pest populations, and economics, how much it costs to put a program in place. And if we're, say, a grower working with yield and aesthetics, how that's going to impact the sales of what we are growing. Sustainability. So things like lowering, not eliminating pest populations, conserving our beneficial plants and animals, carefully considering the environmental risk and toxicity of any control tactic, not just our pesticides and our chemicals. Utilizing and considering low risk control tactics first, and creating and supporting sustainable systems. So this relates a lot to what we're experiencing with climate change that is happening right now and we're going to be experiencing in the future. Now, with IPM, we're talking about plant health, right? And same with our plant diagnostics or when we're learning about insect identification, we're all referencing back to plant health or even the health of our native animals, our local pollinators, and other beneficial insects and organisms. And so when we're caring about our plant health and managed systems, we can't ignore the impacts of climate change, what our plants and animals are facing because of climate change. Things like pollution, droughts, global warming, urbanization, invasive species, and pesticide use. So we have all these things that are impacting our plants and our animals that will impact the overall health of these particular organisms and within our ecosystems as a whole. And so when we're practicing IPM, we want to tune into climate resilient gardening, where we're mitigating the impacts from all those different things that we saw earlier, pollution, extreme weather events. And these can lead to things like changes in plant and animal phenology, timing of their different life stages, changes in animal and plant host ranges, where they're able to survive because of different fluctuations in climate, for instance. And so we can do things like supporting our native plants and animals, pollinators, biodiversity, through different practices, and that includes this concept of IPM, integrated pest management and sustainable pest management. Now, if you're curious to learn more about climate resilient gardening, there's a really great story map that Krista with the Home and Garden Information Center had put together through submitted stories from fellow Marylanders. So highly recommend checking out our story map, which is linked on our bottom right after today's presentation. And some examples of how we can really support this concept of climate resilient gardening by reducing our pesticides and increasing floral resources with this example of growing our tomato plants. So our next key principle and practice is comprehensive knowledge bases. So making sure we get enough information before we make some decisions when it comes to pest management. So gathering as much information as we can or is needed, integrating knowledge of biology, ecology, and plant health practices. Gathering information on site and plant management history, so not only what we are seeing right now within the landscape and with our plants, but what has been seen in the past or what has been applied and done in the past. Taking note of any abiotic, so non-living factors such as climate and weather. Utilizing credible science-based resources. This is very important. There's a lot of information, especially online, but not all of it is science-based. Always make sure to check your references. Consideration of all management options. So we have a pest, maybe we look up, we find, oh, we can do this to manage it. We want to make sure we consider all of the options before we pick that one, that first very one that we saw, or maybe someone else told us that this really worked. When we're talking about integrated pest management, we consider all of the available options because it can really depend on the certain setting, the plant, the situation we have, that what would work best. Maybe it's one certain management option, maybe it's a collection of management options. Really depends on the situation. And we're going to walk through a certain case study a little bit later to demonstrate this. So not all control options should be treated the same. Usually an integration of multiple tactics is needed and beneficial. It's important to stay up to date with the latest control options and recommendations. We are constantly researching new and better and more sustainable ways to manage plant health and the impacts of our pests and our pathogens. Consider current and future plant management practices when we're creating an IPM planner program. So currently what is feasible or doable right now and what we're planning to do in the future in terms of long-term planning and sustainability. And last but not least, continual evaluation and monitoring. Things like the efficacy of our program, how well we are lowering pest populations, changes in costs, changes in plant health quality and aesthetics, if that is important to us, changes in pesticide use, the amount we are using, the toxicity, and changes in knowledge. So these are just some factors that could potentially impact what we're going to do moving forward with our IPM plans. So here are a summary of our key principles and practices. So whether it is with our own IPM plans and programs, or if we are working with someone on their own plans and programs, there are 3 levels of integration when it comes to IPM. The first level is individual pests. So a lot of the time we're working with the public, they'll approach us with a particular pest problem. Say they have a boxwood and they're wondering why the leaves are yellowing, and they're asking if there's a particular pest that is impacting their boxwood. So they're really focused on this individual pest problem. This is normal. This is a great way to enter into the world of IPM. The second level is pest community. So thinking about not only a singular particular pest that we're having an issue with right on this particular plant, but maybe thinking about, oh, are there also other pests on this plant or other pathogens that were impacting this particular plant or certain area of plants, or even at the ecosystem level. So thinking more about managing all different types of pests, not just one particular pest. And then our third level is the ecosystem level. So we can think of it as zooming out. We maybe are focused on this particular problem pest that we're seeing. Maybe we're zooming out a little bit more and thinking about, ooh, the pest community, what other pests could be impacting this plant or this landscape. And then zooming out even further, we're thinking about the ecosystem as a whole. We're thinking about all the different plants and animals that make up a particular area and how they could be impacting each other, impacting the overall health of certain plants in the ecosystem as a whole. And so we hope to maneuver ourselves to think at the ecosystem level. And sometimes we need to zoom in to really focus on a particular pest that's causing a lot of issues. So it's really going to depend on where we are at with our knowledge and our experience, where our goals are at, and then also what makes the most sense. So sometimes it makes sense to zoom in, sometimes it makes sense to zoom out in terms of managing plant health within certain situations. Now we're going to learn about steps of an IPM plan. So thinking about keeping those levels of integration in mind, maybe we'll move between the three of them. Doesn't have to be a steady step up to that third level, but just keeping those things in mind when we're thinking about making our own plans. So just like with definitions of IPM, there are a lot of different IPM steps and processes out there. They all generally have the same concepts and steps, but they may be in different orders. They may separate some of the steps, they may combine some of the steps. So this is one that I'm presenting to you all today, which includes 6 different steps. And I'm thinking of our IPM plan today for our usual situation, especially as a master gardener volunteer or as a home gardener, that we're typically introducing ourselves to IPM or someone's approaching us when there is a problem in place. We have a pest, and so we're starting with that step 1 of gathering information. That could include things like pest identification, using our skills of plant diagnostics, then moving to step 2, assessing the threat. Step 3, assessing management options. Step 4, applying control tactics. Step 5, evaluating and recording results. And then step 6, utilizing preventative tactics. So in other situations, maybe someone's approaching us, say through our Master Gardener Baywise program, they have a landscape consultation. They have that ecosystem perspective, that third level of integration in IPM. They're approaching us before maybe a major pest problem, and they're wondering how they can implement IPM throughout their entire landscape. So maybe we're starting with gathering that information and then going to utilizing preventative tactics before we maybe think about a particular problem and needing to assess the threat. So that's a situation where our steps may change and maneuver, where we have gathering information, and then maybe our step 2 is utilizing those preventative tactics. So this can really change. This is just a general flow of a particular plan. And so we'll go into each of these steps. Some of this information may be familiar, especially if we tuned into our first class of plant diagnostics. We also went through the importance of gathering a comprehensive knowledge base, things like identifying our plant. Maybe that's just a particular plant that we're having issues with. Maybe it's multiple plants within a landscape. Identifying key pests, talking about pest identification, site history, and the right photo can be worth 1,000 words. So if we're working with the public, maybe someone's approaching us with a photo. Photos can be really helpful, but only if we have a lot of information that we can see in that photo. So my example here are some boxwoods on our right. The bottom photo really zoomed in, can tell us a lot, but we also may find it difficult to ID the plant itself. And we also don't know information like context of where it is within the landscape, where it's particularly planted, if there's other plants around it. And so we always like to tell people when you're sending photos with a gardening question that you take multiple pictures. So if we're sending one zoomed in, we're making sure that photo is very clear. A blurry photo, it's going to be really hard to distinguish the certain things that we're seeing. zoomed in nice and clear. We're zooming out so we can see the entire plant, and then zooming out even further so we can see the plant and where it is within your landscape. That can give us a lot of information that can be really helpful. Now, with that information, with really great photos, with descriptors, site history, and so on, we can use this information to reference credible resources to learn more about the particular plant and maybe some key pests and problems that we could be seeing. And so my example here, we have our boxwood page from our University of Maryland Extension website, and it nicely lists out key diseases and pests and management options that we could be seeing, including photos to reference. When we're gathering information, we can think of it also as a tiered system where we can zoom out, looking at the habitat level, and zoom all the way into looking at particular signs and symptoms on particular plants. Now, really important to zoom in and zoom out in terms of context and investigating. So referencing back to our first class of diagnosing plant problems. We are detectives, we are investigators. We aren't always going to be able to quickly look at a photo and recognize what is happening there. Sometimes we need that context, we need that site history, we need to zoom in and zoom out. So there's not always a cheat code to knowing, oh, we see this particular colored spot on a plant, we know exactly what that is. That isn't always the case. Sometimes we need to do a little bit more detective work. And so we have things, some of these photos might be familiar from our first class, like our salt damage on our yews on our bottom right. We can see leaf scorch from high temperatures on hosta on our top left, and even burn on our top right from a soap-based home remedy. So here at Extension, we do not recommend home remedies. They are not science-based. But we can see here, if we just saw that photo of our bean plant leaf on our top right, we may think there's some sort of disease going on. But investigating, learning more, we find out that a soap-based remedy was sprayed and caused this particular patterns and damage that we are seeing. Also important to learn about the plant itself, what is normal to be seen on the plant, like normal spring magnolia leaf drop. Maybe our variegated plants can sometimes look like they have a disease or pest damage symptom, or we're seeing particular products that are showing up on our plants. Like on our bottom, we see some white stuff going on within the foliage of our boxwood. If we were to look up our boxwood on a credible site and key pests, we can see that when we're seeing this white substance, it is most likely caused by our boxwood psyllid, a particular insect pest that creates this protective cottony covering throughout the plant when they are present. And then some other things as we're zooming in closer on our plant, looking for those signs and symptoms of pests. We can see different types of damage categories, like our stippling damage we can see from spider mites on our top left. We see those individual yellowing colorations and discolorations on our plant leaves. We can see fecal spots showing up on the bottoms of leaves from particular pests like lace bugs, and then even looking for signs of the pest itself, where we're seeing different life stages, maybe the egg stage, and looking for different references to see if maybe we can identify those particular eggs and learn about what that pest is we're seeing on our plant. So different things to look for, different hints that really add up to building our case and gathering that comprehensive knowledge base. Step 2 is assessing the threat of a situation. So just because we're seeing an insect on our plant doesn't mean we have a problem and that something needs to be done. Even if we identify that insect as being a potential pest, it's really going to depend on the situation. How much of the pest we are seeing? Are they currently causing damage? What life stage are they at? And so on. And so thinking about damage thresholds, we might not have a particular number or percentage, but considering all the different factors that would go into your particular threshold for damage within your landscape. The amount and type of damage we are seeing, monitoring for active presence of pests. Sometimes we're seeing the symptoms of pest damage, but the pests have moved on and they're gone. Especially this time of year as it gets colder and colder, we may still see the remnants of damage that was done this past summer. Time of year, presence of natural predators and parasitoids. So if we're seeing beneficial insects in our landscape, that could hint that we're having natural control happening. Maybe the threat isn't as immediate and necessary to take control. Maybe our predators and parasitoids are going to help us instead. And the value of the plant itself. So especially when we're working with the public, we'll hear quite a bit that this is a really important plant to them. Maybe it's something that's been passed down in their family. It means a lot to them. It costs a lot. People take a lot of pride in their landscapes, which is awesome. We want to support that. The love of gardening, the love of creating beautiful landscapes. And so hearing people out, meeting them where they are, what is important to them, listening to their goals. And this is going to really play into assessing the threat of a particular situation. So I have some examples on my right. The first one we can see in our middle area, we see these little cutouts, almost like little perfect semicircles on the eastern redbud leaf. And this is an indicator of our native leafcutter bee. And so this is not damage that we would consider significant or significantly impacting our plants, but is a good sign that we have native pollinators within our landscape. So they make these little circle cutouts to create chambers for nesting their young. So this is a really good sign to see if we see these little cutouts. On our top right, we see on a particular maple leaf, we see these weird growths coming off the top. They almost look like pointy little growths, and they're called maple spindle galls created by a particular mite. Now, this might look strange. Some people may think of this as unsightly. I like to try to teach people that it's confetti. It's a little pizzazz added to your maple leaves. Not all maples have these. They're fun. And they do not cause significant damage to the plant. Most of our leaf galls do not cause significant damage. It's purely an aesthetic type of damage. And so when we see this, maybe we assess our damage more. We're thinking more sustainably that we leave this be. They're a part of our landscape and our ecosystem, and they're not significantly harming our tree. Then on our bottom right, we see a little indicator that we have a parasitoid present. So what we're seeing here is on a particular leaf, we have all of these aphids. Now, these aphids might look a little strange because they're all white and grayish and bloated, and they're not moving, and they have little holes for some of them cut out the back. Now, we call these aphid mummies when we see them bloated and white and they're not moving and they're dead. We call them mummies. And this means that a particular aphid attacking parasitic wasp has inserted its eggs inside of that aphid. That egg has hatched, that larval parasitic wasp is feeding inside the aphid, and it will eventually chew that perfect circle out the back of the aphid and emerge out an adult wasp. May sound gruesome, but a really great form of sustainable pest control. So if we have an aphid population within our landscape, but we're seeing these aphid mummies, we know that we have parasitic wasps doing their ecosystem service, controlling our aphids for us, and maybe that means the threat has gone down. We're assessing we have natural predators and parasitoids present. So next, we're going to go through assessing our management options, and this comes into our major control categories that we're going to review. And so most of the time in IPM, we're talking about our different control categories. They're usually presented in the form of some sort of pyramid or tiered system where we have cultural controls on the bottom and chemical controls on the top. Now, why are these presented this way? Well, this is because of the increasing risk as we move up the tiered system. So we place chemical controls at the top because they have the highest risk in terms of potential risk, negative risk in our ecosystems, potential risk of non-target impacts on different animals, versus cultural controls having the lowest amount of risk. And so usually when we're talking about introducing someone to IPM, or if we're using IPM for a long time, when we're referencing our different control tactics, we have these certain categories. We want to start with our cultural controls, considering and utilizing those first because they have the lowest amount of risk, and having chemical controls be our last effort. If nothing else has worked, this is all we seem to be able to do to control our pests, then last resort are chemical controls with the highest risk. So let's go through some examples of all these different categories. We have our cultural, physical, mechanical, biological, and then our chemical controls. So cultural controls can be things like cleaning our tools, making sure we're planting our plant in the right place so it can thrive based on sun, soil, and water availability. Rotating our vegetables. If we have a particular pest problem that we have a pest that really likes the eggplants in a particular area, maybe we move those eggplants and plant them in a different part of our landscape next growing season. It could be things like mulching correctly, fertilizing properly, maybe using disease-resistant plant varieties. So these are just some examples of different cultural control tactics related to plant health care, landscape design, and sanitation. Next, moving up our control pyramid, we have physical, also known as mechanical controls, which are practices related to removing, excluding, or trapping pests. So things that could be like deer fencing, insect netting, or floating row covers, hand picking, squishing, or stomping, like a lot of us are doing with spotted lanternfly, strong water sprays, spraying pests off of our plants, pruning, or even things like insect traps. A lot of time people will use these sticky traps for greenhouses or even in indoor settings. Moving upward, we'll go on to biological control tactics, which is the use of predators, parasitoids, and or pathogens to lower pest populations. So these particular organisms, whether they're predators, parasitoids, or pathogens, are known as biological control agents, beneficials, or natural enemies. So we have these three different commonly used terms to refer to these particular organisms that can help to lower pest populations. So here's some examples of some common predators that we could see. Things like on our far left, assassin bugs. This one's feeding on a spotted lanternfly adult. We have ladybird beetles, also commonly known as ladybugs. Both the adult and the larval stage are predatory, which is awesome. We have lacewing larvae. So adults, they look like beautiful green fairies. And as there's tiny larvae, they're vicious and they're really great predators out there feeding on various soft-bodied insect pests. And then we have some of our vertebrate predators like our birds, our reptiles, and other mammals and so on. Parasitoids. So these are usually a small insect that slowly kills and consumes a larger insect called the host. This parasitoid can either develop inside of the host or on the outside of the host. And there can either be one or more parasitoids per host. It's really going to depend on the parasitoid species. So we have some examples of some common parasitoids on our far right. And so we have things like our Anastatis genus, which attacks different insect eggs. So at the egg stage, we have on our left, we have a Burconid wasp, which is attacking the adult stage of our aphids. And then on our bottom, we see some different parasitoids attacking a caterpillar, so a larval stage. So depending on the parasitic wasp, it can attack different life stages of our pests. And believe it or not, based on what we know today, we predict there's a parasitic wasp species for just about every insect species out there, which is really crazy to think about. And if you want to go even further, delving into parasitic wasps, this is one of my favorite topics. There are things called hyperparasitoids. So we have parasitoids that attack the parasitoids that are attacking the host. So it can be a tiered system and it can get really crazy. And these things can be very tiny, very interesting to look at underneath a microscope. The good news is parasitic wasps do not sting humans and pets. They're only stinging their hosts. They're looking for their hosts. So a lot of them go unnoticed and they naturally occur within our environment. So a big shout out to our unsung heroes of parasitic wasps. We also have pathogens that we can utilize to lower pest populations. Microorganisms such as bacteria, viruses, fungi, and even nematodes, which are a type of roundworm. So some of our key examples listed here, we have things like Bacillus thuringiensis, usually abbreviated as BT. We've heard of that before. Parasitic nematodes. So these roundworms naturally occur within the environment, and depending on the species or the variety, they attack different things. So we can have nematodes that attack plants. We can have nematodes that attack insects, maybe all insects in a particular group or a particular species. Going to depend on the nematode itself. We can purchase nematodes to apply to our landscape to help manage our pests. We also have things like Bavaria bassanii, which is a type of fungus. We can see it impacting this Colorado potato beetle in the middle. Then on our far right, we have an example of nematodes inside of a beetle grub. So all of that spaghetti-looking substance inside of our beetle, kind of gross, but really interesting, are individual nematodes that are attacking this particular grub. Moving up to the top of our control pyramid, we have our chemical control options, which is the use of chemicals to prevent, repel, confuse, or kill pests. So it's really important to read and follow all chemical labels. This is important for us to practice ourselves and to teach others about the label is the law. All the important information we need to know is on that chemical label. We want to read all the directions, all the safety precautions, all the recommended personal protective equipment before we use the product, during using the product, and after the fact when it comes to storage and disposal. This is very important. Home remedies are not recommended and are not science-based. There are potential non-target impacts on beneficial animals when it comes to the use of any sort of chemical-based product. There are scales in terms of toxicity, what we know based on research for a particular product or active ingredients impact on pollinators, for instance. So it's important to educate yourself and really know what product you are purchasing and potentially applying to your landscape. So not all pesticides are created equal with varying toxicity, and not all pesticides work on all pests. So depending on the formulation, the active ingredients, mode of action, if you want to learn more about pesticides, feel free to reach out to me for further resources or get in contact with your local Master Gardener program. But it's really important to learn more about them before we use them. Making sure we're reading the label and that the product that we are considering is actually designed to control a particular pest. Some are known as broad spectrum, where they can kill a huge group of different pests. Some are more specific, targeting a specific group of maybe just moths or just beetle grubs. So it really depends on the product. Before I move on, the National Pesticide Information Center is a really great resource for credible information of learning more about even the basics of pesticides and pesticide use and looking up specific chemical labels. So if you want to learn about a particular active ingredient in a product you're considering, you can look it up through the National Pesticide Information Center. And when we have this tiered system, we have this differentiation between our biorational pesticides and our conventional pesticides with the highest risk at the top. And broadly, we can define our conventional pesticides as synthetic chemicals, things like insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides, versus our biorational pesticides are relatively non-toxic to people with fewer environmental side effects. Of course, this depends on the product itself, but this is just a general definition of what we consider a biorational pesticide. So lower risk, things like our insecticidal soaps, horticultural oils, neem oils, and pyrethrin. Just some examples. So here we have our pyramid of IPM control tactics that we've learned about with our increasing risk as we move up that pyramid with our different categories. Now, We are going to learn about applying control tactics. I'm going to quickly go through this so we can really get to our case study that I want to go through. Different things to consider: time of day, current and future climate, reading our product label and directions, making sure we're recording what we applied. Some tactics may need to be repeated. And then evaluating and recording our results. How well did it work? Do we have a change in cost, change in plant health? Recording our findings and results and taking notes for the next growing season. Utilizing preventative management tactics. So things like maintaining our plant health, proper sanitation practices, crop rotation as we learn with our cultural practices as well. Monitoring regularly, so being on the lookout for certain pests before they outbreak, and so on. It can be really important to think about landscape design. Research has shown time and time again, as we increase structural and species plant diversity, that we create these ecosystems which have refuges, microclimates, and alternate food resources for our beneficial insects, like our predators and our parasitoids. So we invite them in and they help to naturally lower our pest populations, and we have fewer pest outbreaks. This is about thinking ways we can support our beneficial insects by providing them shelter, nectar, pollen, and alternate prey and hosts within our systems to not only attract them, but to also maintain them when it comes to beneficial insects. So a lot of our predators and our parasitoids are omnivores, so they're also feeding on sources of nectar and pollen like many of our pollinators are. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through these so we can get to our IPM case study with our last couple of minutes. So our case study that we have here is what's wrong with my radish leaves. So keeping these steps in mind, we're going to walk through our first 3 steps together. First step, gathering information. And we have these 3 photos that a particular client has approached us with. So let's take a closer look. We have our first photo here, noticing there's something going on with our leaves. Okay. So I want for you to think about, what damage category do you see in this photo? We have 3 different options here. We have discolored, chewed, and distorted. And this refers back to our very first virtual session on diagnosing plant problems. So take a moment, feel free to write your answer in the chat if you'd like. You can see other people's answers. Which do you think are we seeing with this particular radish? Take another moment. So what we're seeing is B, chewed. So we have different damage categories that we learned about in the first class related to damage by insects and mites. And what we are seeing here is a type of chewing damage. Now we also learned about different types within these categories. So we're seeing chewing, but what type of chewing are we seeing? We can remember back about those different types. We have 3 different options here. We have shot holes, etching, and defoliation. Which do you think it is? Okay, answer is A, shot holes. We have these small, perfect little circles that we're seeing throughout our plant, and this is known as shot holes. So if we want to refer back to our first class, we can learn about these a little bit more and some further examples. So we're seeing chewing, specifically shot holes, happening on our radish leaves. So let's zoom in. We are seeing some sort of insect pest on our plant. So let's see if we can identify what type of insect we're seeing. Now, we learned in our second class about insect identification. We broadly learned about the big orders, the main groups that I think is really important to learn how to differentiate, with our common names of our insect order first listed, things like beetles, true bugs, and flies, and next to it in parentheses is the scientific order name. So what do you think we're seeing here? Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit further so we can see some of those distinguishing traits. Even zoom in more to look at the mouth part. What do you think? Are we seeing beetles, true bugs, or flies? So our answer here is A. What we are seeing are beetles. So beetles commonly refers to the order of Coleoptera. And that is because of these distinguishing traits of our wings. The top pair of wings are hard or leathery. We call these elytra. So this is unique to beetles in the order of Coleoptera. We're also seeing chewing mouth parts. Might be a little bit difficult to see with our photo here, but we're not seeing a straw-like proboscis. So what we're seeing is a chewing mouth part, which is key and important to our beetles. And also the damage symptoms that we're seeing, right? So what we're specifically seeing here are flea beetles. So we learned about the type of damage we're seeing, the type of pests we're also seeing. So thinking to yourself, what other questions would you ask this particular client? Since we're short on time, you can feel free to think about this a little bit later. I do anticipate, since we're coming up on 1 o'clock already, we are going to go a couple minutes over 1 o'clock just so we can get through this nice case study. If you do need to leave, feel free to. You can reference the recording. If you're able to stick around with us, wonderful. So let's move forward with developing our knowledge base. So it's different things we can consider when we're working with a particular client, gathering further information. So different things we can ask is, has this been a reoccurring issue? Where are the radish plants located if we don't have a photo to show this? Have you applied anything such as pesticides, and what other plants are nearby? We can use this information. So what we learned so far, we're seeing shot holes, we're seeing beetles. So we can literally type this in. We type in beetles, shot holes, radish leaves, UMD extension to get that credible resource. And the very first thing that pops up is flea beetles on vegetables. We're able to click on that resource, and we have a web page on this that will give us information such as our life cycle and habitats, and prevention and control measures that we can reference and provide to the client we're working with, or to reference for ourselves. So next, we're going to assess the threat. Briefly, we'll think about things like, when are you planning to harvest your radish leaves? And are there other nearby plants that may be impacted? So other different types of host plants that our flea beetles may get on and to start to create that damage. We can also reference the flea beetle species life cycle. Sometimes it can be important to identify the flea beetle further beyond it's a flea beetle. We have lots of different species within Maryland. So if you need help with further identification, you can reach out to us here at Extension. We have an Ask Extension resource, and we can reference a specific life cycle and thinking about where they're at within their life stage. If they're still creating damage at this time of year, maybe they're entering what we call their overwintering stage. We do not need to worry about them till the spring. We're thinking about different control tactics that will target these different life stages. So important things to consider when we're talking about assessing the threat. Next, we're going to assess our management options, thinking back to our IPM control tactics pyramid. So here we are within our client's landscape, whether we are ourselves or we have a photo, thinking about this radish issue that we're finding. So we have our radishes here. We have our old tomato plants that they have planted right next to them in the same growing bed. And then also in a second growing bed nearby, they have spinach. So some things to consider. We may also be noticing other things within our landscape, flowers, other plants. And for this particular case study, we are in the season of fall. So let's go through some control tactics. Thinking about an IPM plan, thinking about integration of different control tactics. So we'll first start on the bottom of our pyramid, lowest risk control tactics, known as cultural control tactics. The first thing we could do is dispose of tomato plant debris that could be harboring overwintering flea beetles. Most of our flea beetle species will overwinter in the adult stage in any type of plant debris. So getting rid of that plant debris, things like removing weeds as well, and disposing of radish debris once we have harvested our radishes. Next, we'll go to our physical controls. We can install row covers over our spinach, for instance, because our flea beetles may start to attack our spinach leaves. If we are still waiting to harvest those, we're still seeing active beetles, maybe we consider a row cover. We can also consider lightly tilling the soil post-harvest. Thinking about biological, we can support our predators and our parasitoids by planting floral resources. Go through these. And then as we get into the spring, thinking about the future for our client or for ourselves, what is coming in the spring that we can do? Talking specifically about late April, early May for our flea beetles. We'll just go through some examples. We can monitor for signs and symptoms. We can continue to remove those weeds. We can think about crop rotation, maybe moving our radishes to a particular different growing bed or area of our landscape. We can think about companion planting. So some research has shown particular plants planted together can help to deter particular pests. So we have some examples here of spring onions and dill. We can wait to plant. So thinking about the life cycle of our pests, if we have a peak population, maybe we're planting after that peak population. Thinking about row covers in the spring, thinking about incorporating more blooming plants. If we're thinking about chemical-based options, we have some products such as kale and clay product. But just some examples, last resorts thinking about our chemical options. So I just wanted to demonstrate here a real example, a landscape, and how an IPM plan can really be taken place. These are all things we could consider. We don't have to utilize all these management tactics, but we can really see within our landscape as a whole, we have a particular pest issue, but thinking broader for what else is in our landscape and what control tactics can we use. Okay, so as we conclude here, when we're working with the public, we want to meet people where they are along their home horticulture journey. So depending on what they're focused on in a particular time, maybe someone's really focused on growing food. Maybe in the future, they become more interested in attracting and conserving pollinators, incorporating native plants, and so on. So meeting people where they are, not forcing them in a particular direction. Thinking about where their perspective's at. Maybe they're only thinking about individual pests right now. Maybe we can start to introduce them to looking at a more pest community level or an ecosystem level viewpoint, especially emphasizing how this can really help build sustainable landscapes and help with long-term pest control. This has to do with understanding a particular person's goals, resources, experiences, and concerns. And there are a lot of things that influence someone's gardening practices and behaviors. If you want to learn more, that was a really interesting recent study that was done in the UK that looked at all the different factors that will impact someone gardening in their front area of their house. Things like neighbors, gardening and retail centers, even landlords or building companies. So lots of different things that will influence someone's behaviors to garden. Whether someone's thinking about their broader landscape as a whole or a particular plant or pest problem, IPM has a place. So we can always introduce IPM to people in lots of different situations. Here are some general tips for answering gardening questions. I won't read through all these. These are also in the note-taking guide. So feel free to reference them and feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you may have. Last but not least, thank you for sticking with us. I'm just going to walk through some, I think, really important resources when it comes to finding information, credible science-based information for developing IPM plans, plant diagnostics, and even identifying pests. So here's our University of Maryland Extension website. This is the main page. we're thinking about home gardening and the topics we're going through today in the past 2 sessions, we want to click on Yard and Garden Resources. Once we click here, it will lead us to this main page of different categories that we can click through. Now, this can end up being somewhat of a maze. So if we have a particular topic we're really interested in, I highly recommend Googling your topic and then right next to it, typing in UMD extension. And that should help to get you directly to the pages you would be most interested in. Or you can explore through our multiple categories as well. We also have our base page for a Home and Garden Information Center on our left, which links to a lot of really great resources as well. On our right, we have our Maryland Grows blog, which you can sign up for. We have really great writers, some of our faculty specialists, even local master gardeners, writing in articles that can really help to learn more about topics like plant diagnostics and IPM. You can also follow us on social media. If you're on any of the social media platforms that we have, we post lots of really cool science-based, timely information updates related to sustainable home horticulture. We have monthly gardening tips and tasks. We have a page for each month. If you would like to get more timely information, we can see different topics that we lay out here. I've been working on our insects page, including both pests and beneficial insects and tips on how you can support the beneficials and manage the pests. These are quick tips, links to further pages if you want to learn more about these particular insects or topics. So highly recommend checking these out. We have a pest predictive calendar, which is designed for our ornamental plants, but could be a really great resource for thinking about pests that we could anticipate coming up. There are some really great links on here for how to use this pest predictive calendar. We have our Ask Extension resource. This is free. You can submit any question with photos and someone will get back to you in about 3 days from one of our specialists. And then last but not least, we have our local county and city master gardener programs. So if you're new to the master gardener world, I highly recommend finding your local master gardener program. And we have this really great map that was created by our master gardener state office. Caitlin created this amazing map to show where certain plant clinics. So if you want to go to an Ask a Master Gardener plant clinic to help with plant diagnostics, where those are located, as well as our demonstration gardens. Here are some key takeaways from today's presentation. Feel free to reference these later. It could be a really great summary, reference all that we've gone through today. With that, I'll end with this quote. Education is a partnership. When we work together with someone, we build trust, inspire growth, and create lasting understanding. So thank you to those who stuck around. My apologies. It always ends up being a little bit longer than I thought. I think this is the pilot training program. I think we'll go for a little bit longer of a scheduled time for some of these training topics. But thank you for your interest, whether you've been joining us live or through the recordings. I'm happy to answer questions now and always through email if you need to reach out to me after today. Thank you, everyone.
Maddie, did you want to go through the Q&A?
Good question. If you don't mind sticking around, Stephanie, I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer to answer some.
Okay, cool. So there's just 3 that are in there, so hopefully it won't be too much over. But the first one is, can you speak to the advisability of buying ladybugs and praying mantids for release into the environment? I'm assuming as for biocontrol.
Yes, so that is a great question. I would highly recommend looking into the particular species that you're buying because a lot of the ladybugs that are bred are non-native and are the usually generally called our Asian ladybird beetles, and research has shown that they can vector and transmit disease to our native ladybird beetle species. So I would not recommend getting non-native ladybugs, for instance, to purchase and release. So those are the ones I usually find to purchase, unfortunately. And the same goes for our mantids. So I always like to preach that any mantids we're finding naturally in our landscape are beneficial. We should not be targeting and killing non-native mantid species. They are not technically invasive, even though there's a lot of misinformation out there that says they are invasive. They're non-native, but we shouldn't be buying more non-native mantids and spreading them in our landscape. So if we're able to find a native species of any of our predators and parasitoids to release, great. So just make sure you look into that a little bit more.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, the next one is it okay to compost tomato plants in the fall, or would it be better to dispose of them?
Good question. So that's going to really depend on the health of your tomato plant throughout the growing season. So if we had any sort of presence of pathogens such as diseases or pests, we want to look into what that particular pest or pathogen is, what their life cycle is, and if it could persist through keeping it in our compost. So a lot of the times, if we had some sort of pest or pathogen throughout the season, we say to dispose of that plant debris, not to compost it, but it's really going to depend on that particular pest or pathogen too.
Awesome. Okay, and in reference to the pest predictive calendar, which I know you referenced, is there a specific one for vegetable plants?
I'm not aware of one made through University of Maryland Extension. Yeah. So there might be other ones out there through other extension institutions. I'm not aware of one that I can particularly recommend. So something we could work on and develop. But just something to think about. It's a great introduction to learning about growing degree days if we are new to that concept, and thinking about how we can use current climate and weather to predict the different life stages and life cycles of our pest insects.
Okay, this is a great one, Maddie. I know you've talked about it, and I know you never get tired of sharing this answer because it's just coming up so much right now. Do lanternflies damage host trees, and is it not advisable to spray them with dish soap or vinegar?
Oh my goodness. Yes, great question. I'm happy to
Yeah,
answer this.
yeah.
Um, so we do not recommend any sort of home remedies that includes soap or vinegar or anything like that, especially not bleach. That is very scary. I've seen people online posting they're spraying bleach in their yard. Please do not do that. So when it comes to spotted lanternflies, what we have found so far through lots of research and observations is they do not significantly damage plants unless we have things like grapevines or hops, or what we're seeing is saplings of black walnut and tree of heaven, which is an invasive itself. They could potentially impact those types of plants. But everything else in our yard, what we're generally seeing is not a significant harm in plant health. So a lot of misinformation out there that spotted lanternfly is killing all our plants. This is not true. What we are seeing is a huge amount of honeydew, which is a byproduct of their feeding. They are piercing, sucking insects. So they have that straw-like mouth part, feeding on sugary substance. They're excreting sugary substance. And from that can grow sooty mold. We may have seen that. It's very dark and black, can accumulate around the base of a host plant tree. So that sooty mold will hopefully die off with the cold temperatures. It also generally doesn't impact plant health unless it is covering foliage that could block photosynthesis. So if you want to learn more about spotted lanternfly, I do have a webinar on our HGIC YouTube page that goes into recent information about spotted lanternfly, and I also go through sustainable control tactics, so thinking about IPM. But we generally do not recommend spraying if we can, because they are highly mobile pests. And so if we're spraying, this is very temporary control. They can easily fly away and come back. So just something to consider.
Awesome. Great. I'm glad we got a chance to cover that one. The next question is, I'm planning on leaving my leaves in the lawn this year in order to give undisturbed habitat to overwintering insects, especially fireflies. Is this a good practice, or will it also protect insects that could also be damaging?
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you are considering leaving your leaves. This is something we definitely support. And it really depends on the situation as well. If we're talking about kind of a like a conservation area of our yard where we're not growing vegetables in that particular area, we're not seeing like pest issues in a particular area, then we recommend leaving the leaves. shallow leaf piles if we can. If we are worried about grass or turf being killed underneath it, then thinking about the depth of that leaf pile, because if we get too thick, it could kill off the grass underneath. But generally, leaving the leaves in certain areas of our yard are highly beneficial. Recent research has shown that this really supports a lot of our native moth and butterfly species, which is really cool. There's lots of different things other than insects, such as our native animals and turtles that utilize leaf litter as habitat. So really great to leave in your yard. Now, when we're talking about our vegetable beds, we're having consistent pest and pathogen problems. That's when we want to get rid of that particular plant debris. The leaves falling from our trees, usually, if we don't have any kind of pest or pathogen issue, leaving them be is great.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, we've got one more. I have Mycosphorella colorata damage on my Calmia latiflora. What besides neem oil would help with this problem? And what is the best time of year to apply an antifungal?
Okay, I'm gonna have you contact us later with that particular issue. I'm not gonna be able to give that off the top of my head, but feel free to reach out to me or our Ask Extension service, and we can definitely get you that information.
Awesome. We did have a question in the chat about what about house cleaning products that seem to smell like they are bleach based?
In terms of
I think using
using
them in the landscape.
definitely
Yeah.
not using them in the landscape. Yep, any sort of home remedies, we're not recommending to use in the landscape. Only things that are certified chemical products that are designed to be used as pesticides.
Awesome. All right, and I'm putting the link for Ask Extension in as a response to the one question because that's super specific and we'll have great folks on our team who can help answer that for you.
For sure.
Are there any apps that you would recommend for recognizing pathogens? Ooh, I
Ooh.
wish.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any that are that advanced yet. I'm
That
hoping
would
we get there, but that would be really cool.
that would be pretty impressive. Someone asked if there are handouts for today. And I know you mentioned one. Will the link to the handout also be on the recording?
Yes. Well, it's been emailed out to all registrants. So if you haven't received it, you can feel free to send me an email directly. It is a PDF document and it was basically a note-taking guide. It does have the references links linked on the last page. So you can
Okay,
click on those directly virtually through that PDF.
cool. Um, okay, sorry. Clarification on the question about using other household products, not using them on the landscape, but could they harm the plants near the house?
It's really going to depend on how you're using them and if they're potentially kind of drifting or getting onto your plants. If you have more questions on this, I recommend reaching out to our Ask Extension service and we can help you kind of work through that.
Awesome. All right, that's everything.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie, for your help. And thank you, everyone, for
Sure.
sticking around. And thank you for interacting with this training series. I will be sending out a follow-up survey and I would really love your feedback. Awesome.
All right, sounds good, Maddie. We'll go ahead and stop the recording now, and then we'll get